Thank you very much, Robin. Good morning, everybody. It's fantastic to be here in this wonderful hotel, which I think that I opened or reopened. I opened many hotels in London in the course of my time as mayor. I definitely reopened this hotel at one stage because this is, after all, an example of the kind of infrastructure that you were just talking about, Robin. It is an inspirational structure that was created many decades ago, over 100 years ago, and it has been beautifully upgraded and has stood the test of time. And that is what I want to talk about this morning, because all you young, thrusting Chatham House types look far too dynamic to remember the early 1980s or indeed the late 1970s. I mean, do you? I certainly do. And I remember being chilled to the marrow, not just by the newspaper graphics, the hundreds of nuclear missiles trained on this country by the Warsaw Pact. Scarier still were the attempts by the UK government to reassure the population. The pamphlets and films that told you such things as how to build a fallout shelter. You took several doors off their hinges and propped them up diagonally against a wall, reinforced them with suitcases full of books, and then you were told to tune to Radio 4, where the contingency plan was to play endless reruns of Just a Minute. And there really was a time when British children knew all about 4-minute warnings and the perils of radiation sickness, and we all read a book called Where the Wind Blows by Raymond Briggs. Anybody remember that? And we brooded, I did as a teenager, on the horror of those weapons. And for decades now, that threat has seemed to vanish. It went with the end of the Cold War. We don't want it back. And that is why people are watching with such interest and the first stirrings of apprehension the events in the Korean Peninsula. Kim Jong Un has tested 19 missiles so far this year and has conducted 4 of the 6 nuclear tests ever carried out by that country. It is now widely accepted that Kim is coming closer to being able to launch a nuclear-armed ICBM at the continental United States. I should stress that this has not only prompted outrage in America, but it is a prospect that has been unanimously condemned by Russia, by China, by the EU, to say nothing of the dismay of those quintessentially peaceable countries, Japan and South Korea. It is this increased tempo of nuclear testing, coupled with florid outbursts of verbal belligerence, that have reawakened, even in this country, those forgotten fears. The public can be forgiven for genuinely starting to wonder whether the nuclear sword of Damocles is once again held over the head of a trembling human race. So now is perhaps a good moment, in a calm and dispassionate way, to take stock. Before we reissue that old pamphlet called Protect and Survive, before we teach our kids how to hide under the desks or lay on stocks of baked beans or Spam, let us look at the history of nuclear proliferation, how nuclear weapons have spread, and how we have collectively sought to contain their spread. Back then, as now, most predictions were gloomy. And yet those gloomy predictions have been utterly confounded by events. America was, of course, the first to use the bomb in 1945. Then the Soviet Union detonated a device at Semipalatinsk in 1949. We were next, the UK, in 1952. The French did their test in the Sahara in 1960. At that point, the then American presidential candidate, John F. Kennedy, predicted that by 1964, within only 4 years, there would be 10, 15, or 20 nations that would acquire nuclear weapons. As things have turned out, it is now almost 60 years after he issued his warning, and yes, the NPT has some notable non-signatories, including India and Pakistan. And yet, the number of nuclear-armed countries has yet to reach double figures. This is, on the face of it, an absolutely astonishing statistic and an extraordinary achievement. When you consider that every previous military development, from firearms to fighter jets, has spread among humanity like impetigo, you have to ask yourselves, why? Why have nuclear weapons been the great exception? It can't just be the kit. They can't be so complex that only a handful of so-called advanced nations have the intellectual wherewithal to make them. It's true that the process is laborious and highly expensive, but the basic technology is more than 70 years old, and indeed has been taught in universities, if not schools, for decades, generations. The answer is partly that many countries wisely decided after the war that they were going to take shelter under the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States. Nations in both Europe and in Asia opted for this protection, a commitment that must be rated one of the greatest contributions by America to the unprecedented epoch of peace and prosperity that we have all been living through. I should observe that some European countries found themselves under a rival umbrella provided by the Soviet Union, though at that stage they had no choice in the matter. It was that American offer, that guarantee, that made possible the global consensus embodied by the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. By this treaty, 191 nations came together to recognize the special role of the 5 existing nuclear powers, and also to insist that there should be no further dispersal of such weapons. Nuclear technology would be made available to other countries, provided it was used exclusively for civilian purposes. That was a great diplomatic achievement. It was an effort in which the UK, as one of the leading upholders of the post-war rules-based international order, played a crucial role. The British delegation was led by Alan Chalfont, now Lord Chalfont, the Labour minister, who was, and at the age of 100, almost 100, still is a representative of the days when Labour was both hawkish and commonsensical on nuclear deterrence. That diplomacy has helped to make the world safer, more secure, more confident, and therefore more prosperous. It has helped to avoid what might otherwise have been a Gadarene rush to destruction, in which the world was turned into a great arena of Mexican standoffs, a nuclear version of the final scene of Reservoir Dogs. That farsightedness is now needed more than ever, not only to keep the NPT, but also one of its most valuable complementary accords, the nuclear deal with Iran. To grasp the importance of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, we should remember that just before it was signed in 2015, Iran had enough centrifuges and low-enriched uranium to be only months away from producing the essential material for at least one nuclear weapon. Let us remember what the consequences would have been for Iran and the world if Tehran had gone down that road. Never mind the response of Israel, or indeed the United States, to the fact of nuclear weapons in the grip of the Iranians, a regime that has been capable of blood-curdling rhetoric about the mere existence of the Zionist entity, a nuclear-armed Iran would have placed irresistible pressure on neighboring countries to up the ante and to trigger an arms race in what is already one of the most volatile regions of the world. Imagine all those mutually contaminating, sectarian, dynastic, internecine conflicts in the Middle East today. Then turn the dial and add a nuclear arms race. Think of the nightmare that deal has avoided. It is a nightmare we can continue to avoid if we are sensible and if we show the same generosity and wisdom as the negotiators of the NPT. And first and most important, it's important to understand, vital to understand, that President Trump has not withdrawn from the JCPOA. He has not junked it. He has continued to waive nuclear-related sanctions against Iran, and having spoken to some of the most influential figures on Capitol Hill, none of them fans of the Iranian regime, I have absolutely no doubt that with determination and with courage, the JCPOA can be preserved. This is not just because the essential deal is in the interests of Western security, though it is, but because it is profoundly in the interests of the Iranian people. This is a great nation of 80 million people, two-thirds of whom are under the age of 30. They are highly educated, both men and women. They watch YouTube. They dance to music videos, even if it is in the privacy of their own home. They use and understand technology. They're bursting with capitalist and entrepreneurial spirit. If we can show them they are welcome in the great global marketplace of ideas and innovation, then in time, a very different relationship is possible with the modern heirs of what is, after all, one of the greatest of all ancient civilizations. That is the possibility that the JCPOA holds open. Not just averting a perilous and debilitating arms race, but ending the long and largely self-imposed exclusion of Iran from the global mainstream that so many millions of Iranians yearn to join. Of course, we in the UK share with our American friends and with many of our allies in Europe and across the Middle East, the concern, the legitimate concern, over the disruptive behavior of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in countries hundreds of miles from their borders. It is simply provocative and dangerous that Iran has supplied tens of thousands of rockets and missiles to Hezbollah in Lebanon, weapons that even now are pointing at Israel, but whose use would bring the most destructive retaliation not on Iran, the responsible party, but upon the people of Lebanon. It is of no conceivable benefit to the tormented people of Yemen that Iran should be supplying missiles to the Houthi rebels, which they use routinely to strike targets in Saudi Arabia. Behavior which, alas, can only strengthen the convictions of those in the region who believe they have no choice but to respond to Iran's actions. And frankly, it's astonishing that the Iranians, who rightly complain that the world looked the other way when they suffered so tragically from the chemical weapons deployed by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, should even now be abetting and concealing the crimes of Bashar al-Assad, who has used the same methods against his own people. And so I think it's right that we should join with our American friends and allies to counter this kind of behavior wherever possible. But that does not mean for 1 minute that we should write Iran off, or that we should refuse to engage with Iran, or that we should show disrespect to its people. On the contrary, we should continue to work to demonstrate to that population in Iran that they will be better off, under this deal and the path of re-engagement that it prescribes. And that is the model of toughness but engagement, each reinforcing the other, that we should have at the front of our mind as we try to resolve the tensions in the Korean Peninsula. And I think it's right that Rex Tillerson has specifically opened the door to dialogue. He's tried to give some sensible reassurances to the regime to enable them to take up this offer. Remember the 4 no's that have been offered by the South Korean president and reinforced by the US Secretary of State. No seeking regime change in North Korea, no seeking to force the collapse of North Korea's regime, no seeking to deploy US forces beyond the 38th parallel, no attempt to accelerate the reunification of Korea. These are the commitments that we hope will encourage Kim Jong Un to halt his nuclear weapons program, to come to the negotiating table and thereby to take the only path that can guarantee the security of the region as a whole. You will often hear it said that in weighing up those options, Kim must bear in mind the woeful precedents of those who disarmed. Of Libya, where the leader listened to the blandishments of the West and gave up his nuclear weapons program, only to be overthrown with Western connivance. Or of Ukraine, which actually surrendered its nuclear arsenal only to suffer the first forcible loss of territory in Europe since 1945. It is therefore suggested that Kim would be sealing his own fate if he were to comply. I reject those analogies. What finished Gaddafi was an uprising of his own people, including on the streets of Tripoli, even if he'd been able to perfect a nuclear arsenal in time. And even if it is true that he had a justified reputation for mercurial and unpredictable behavior, it seems unlikely that he would have decided to nuke his own capital, including himself. As survival strategies go, that would have been eccentric even by his own standards. As for Ukraine, the fundamental difference is that no one, not South Korea nor any other neighbor, has any designs on the national territory of North Korea. And the crucial question Kim Jong Un surely needs to ask himself is whether his current activities are making Pyongyang any safer for himself and for his regime. No one, I'm sure no one in this room, certainly no one in the UK and indeed around the world, wants any kind of military solution to this problem. No one actively desires that outcome. But Kim Jong Un and the world need to understand that when the 45th President of the United States contemplates a regime led by a man who not only threatens to reduce New York to ashes, but who stands on the verge of acquiring the power to make good on his threat, I'm afraid that the US president, whoever he or she might be, will have an absolute duty to prepare any option to keep safe not only the American people, but all those who have sheltered under the American nuclear umbrella. And I hope Kim will also consider this, that if his objective is to intimidate the US into wholesale withdrawal from East Asia, then it strikes me that his current course might almost be designed to produce the opposite effect. Already, President Moon of South Korea, hitherto seen as one of the political leaders most open to engagement with the North, is installing US-made THAAD missile defenses. And in Japan and South Korea, it is easy to imagine the growth of domestic pressure for those governments to take further steps to protect their own populations from a nuclear North Korea. In short, Pyongyang faces the same dilemma as Tehran. By continuing to develop nuclear capabilities, Kim risks provoking a reaction in the region that is at once defensive and competitive, that reduces, not increases, his security and therefore reduces, not increases, the survival chances of their regime. And therefore, I hope that Kim will see that it is no part of Juche, his family doctrine of national self-reliance, nor is it in the interest of his national security to end up with an escalation of America's military presence in East Asia, let alone to run the risks that could imperil his regime. And until he understands that, I'm afraid we have no choice collectively but to step up the pressure on Pyongyang. And it's one of the most encouraging developments this year that the UN Security Council, with the strong support of the UK, has unanimously passed 3 resolutions to tighten the economic ligature around the regime. When I joined a debate on North Korea in the Security Council earlier this year, I was struck by the unaccustomed absence of discord. For the first time, the Chinese have agreed to impose strict limits on the export of oil to North Korea, which until now was taboo. There has been an unmistakable change in Chinese policy, and that is warmly to be welcomed. In his speech to the 19th Party Congress last week, President Xi hailed China's standing as a world power. And I would say there is no more urgent problem for China to address, nor any where Beijing has greater influence than the threat to international security represented by the behavior of North Korea. There is also unprecedented discussion between China and the US on how to handle this crisis, a closest, by the way, that I believe bodes well for the world. And I should again pay tribute to my colleague Rex Tillerson for his efforts. Whatever we may think of the regime and its behavior, the ruling elite in North Korea is in the end composed of human beings. We must find ways of getting through to them, and at the same time, not just toughening the sanctions regime, but enforcing those already in place. And in this respect, again, the Chinese hold the key. This is the moment for North Korea's regime to change course. And if they do, the world can show that it is once again capable of the diplomatic imagination that produced the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, arduously negotiated back then, and after 12 years of continuous effort, produced the JCPOA nuclear deal with Iran. It won't be easy, but the costs of failure could be catastrophic. We cannot disinvent nuclear weapons or wish them away. And the events in the Korean Peninsula are the clearest possible rejoinder to those, such alas as Jeremy Corbyn in at least some of his pronouncements, though I accept in this matter as in so many others, he says different things at different times, to those who say we should unilaterally cast aside our nuclear weapons. To wield a nuclear deterrent, as this country does, is neither easy nor cheap. Indeed, it imposes a huge responsibility on any country. We are one of the handful specifically recognized by the NPT to possess such dreadful weapons, and we do so not just in the name of our own security, but via NATO for the protection of dozens of our allies. And by holding that stockpile, a minimum stockpile, I should say, which has been reduced by half since its Cold War peak, we play our part in deterring the ambitions of rogue states. It is 25 years since the end of the Cold War, and a new generation has grown up with no memory of the threat of nuclear winter and little education in the appalling logic of mutually assured destruction. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, their destruction, the full horror of what took place, is now literally fading from living memory. When people like Alan Chalfant drew up the NPT, those horrors were still fresh in the hearts of the world. We must not be so forgetful or so complacent as to require a new lesson in what these weapons can do, or the price of failing to limit their spread. The NPT is one of the great diplomatic achievements of the last century. It has stood the test of time. In its restraint and its maturity, it shows an unexpected wisdom on the part of humanity, an almost evolutionary instinct for the survival of our species. It is the job of our generation now to preserve that agreement, and British diplomacy will be at the forefront of that endeavour. Thank you all very much indeed for your attention this morning. Thank you so much.
Foreign Secretary, I know you've been kind enough to say you'll take a few questions, and there was a couple I wanted just to kick off on behalf of everyone here. You really split that talk into two pieces, the Iran piece, the North Korea piece, both examples of ways that we're having to face the challenge of sustaining the structure of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What I would ask maybe as a first question is, given that the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that's been done with Iran, is there, and I think I heard you support it quite strongly, and you noted that President Trump has not abandoned it. But is the British government then in a position to keep supporting British companies investing in Iran at a time when it looks like the United States, at least, does not believe, as you do, in the value of this agreement in the long term? Can British companies have the kind of confidence, and other companies, but from any other part of the world for that matter, that the kind of plan to help Iran take advantage of the economic opportunities of this agreement, that's only going to happen if investment comes in? So what would you say about that part of the deal?
Yeah, I think just to get back to thanks, Robin, what I was saying in the speech, it's crucial for people to understand that the core of the deal, which was a trade-off between Iranian good behavior on its program for military use, nuclear research and program, and economic progress, and economic engagement with Iran, the core of that deal is still there, and it has not been voided by the president, and he's not abrogated, he's not junked it, he has not torn it up, and that was very clear from his statement, and it's very clear on Capitol Hill as well. So to the extent that Iran abides by, and the IEA is very clear that Iran is in conformity with the nuclear provisions of the deal, to the extent that Iran abides by that deal, then yes, we must continue to see economic engagement and progress. And I think that's absolutely vital, that the Iranian people should see the benefits of the JCPOA. And I think it's vital that we should keep that work of investment and trade between our countries. So I would certainly encourage that. At the same time, it is clear that Iran is up to disruptive behavior, let's put it that way. Makes them sound like a glorified tech company, but it's worse than that. Disruptive behavior in the region that we need to constrain. And I itemized some of the ways in which the Iranians are, in my view, and in the view of many up to no good, we need to be working very hard with our allies to push back on that, and we are.
And on North Korea, one quick question on that as well. So you said there should be creative solutions, there should be some ways forward. Would you see, over time, a JCPOA equivalent for North Korea? And if so, is this a time when the United Kingdom, France, Germany, there was an E3 that got involved on the Iranian issue when Americans were skeptical and when the situation looked like it was really stuck. Is this a moment where Britain's going to act by itself? Is it a case of creating a bit of a team like was done on the case of Iran? I mean, what can we offer?
I think the crucial thing at the moment is not to dissipate the focus of the diplomatic activity at the moment. And I tried to be clear that I think the single most productive avenue for diplomacy at present is Chinese economic pressure. And that is the thing that I think can make a difference. As everybody knows, the Chinese control 93% of North Korea's external trade. They control the oil supplies. It's they who really have the future of that economy in their hands. It's a heavy responsibility for China. No one's pretending this is easy for Beijing. But I think one of the most encouraging things we've seen in the last few months is the willingness of the Chinese leadership to adjust their policy, to take account of the real uncertainties, the risks from Pyongyang, and to take action. Now, there is more, in my view, that the Chinese can do, and we should certainly encourage them down that path.
Right. We've got a little bit of time for some questions, so I've got a few hands that I've seen go up, and so let me do a bit of a mix of speakers first. So first I'll go here. Gentleman there.
Thank you. Carl Dinnan from ITV News. You won't be surprised, notwithstanding your speech, this is about Brexit. How much more money should the UK offer the European Union to move on to trade talks, given that the EU is already offering to start talking about trade talks internally?
Well, thanks very much, Carl, and you're totally forgiven for raising the subject, which I think you'll notice I studiously, successfully avoided. The reality is that I certainly think that the Prime Minister in her Florence speech gave a very fair account of how we want to proceed on citizenship, on finances, on the rights and privileges dossier. The UK has made what we think is a pretty good offer. I'm glad that at the Council in Brussels, they seemed more positive, frankly, than I thought they were going to be, to judge by some of the anticipatory drum roll of that Council. They've given a fair wind to the idea of themselves now discussing the new trade deal, or however they want to proceed. I suggest, humbly, to our friends and partners in Brussels, now is the time to get on with it. Let's not let I dare not wait upon I would, or let the native hue of resolution be sicklied o'er with a pale cast of thought, or whatever. There is a current in the affairs of men. They should grip it, get on with it, and start thinking about the future. And I'm sure that we can both think very creatively and very positively about how to come to arrangements that suit our constituents on both sides of the channel, and benefit businesses not just in this city, but in Paris, in Frankfurt, and across the whole of Europe.
Let me keep a little bit on the press side, John, as well, because otherwise I'll cluster a little bit. Yeah.
Foreign Secretary, it is your job to strengthen British influence. Yet in Brussels and among European leaders, the Prime Minister is seen as weak in relation to her party. You have been so outspoken about your view of Brexit that some of your colleagues have called for you to be sacked. So, on Brexit,
identify these people. I spring them, produce them, John.
You've been very outspoken about your vision of Brexit. So have you been helping Brexit or helping to weaken Theresa May?
Well, as I said just now in my answer to Carl, we think that the offer that the Prime Minister made at Florence, and I remind you that the entire British cabinet is united around every dot, comma, syllable of the Florence speech. We think it's an excellent text. It's an excellent basis on which to proceed, and we hope our European friends and partners agree. I trust everybody has read, all you foreign policy junkies, you've all read the Florence speech, haven't you?
Not everyone here is from Europe, or Britain for that matter.
But they are nonetheless foreign policy junkies.
No, actually, I think quite a few different sectors here, actually.
I'm so sorry.
And I'll show that by the next set of questions, actually. I'll take one of my colleagues here, because I know there's a report coming out, and I know where it's going to take us, I think, so that'll be useful. I'll come around.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to say you were foreign policy junkies if you're foreign policy junkies. I'm so sorry.
Orisa Lutsevich, I manage Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, and I appreciate, Foreign Secretary, you mentioned Ukraine, but also Belarus and Kazakhstan gave up the nukes. But we know what is the big elephant in the room. It's Crimea. And it's the territorial integrity that was guaranteed by Russia. For the same matter, United Kingdom, United States, France, and China were co-signatories. What is your proposition? How can we resolve Crimea to restore trust in international law?
Well,
thanks.
You're putting your finger on one of the most agonizing sore points of the a diplomatic, a political failure of, and indeed an act of aggression. That has so far we have found no adequate, to which we've so far found no adequate response, and we must be honest about that, because Russian behaviour in Crimea was, as I said, the first seizure of sovereign territory of another European country since 1945, and yes, it was dismaying and it remains shocking. That's why the United Kingdom has been in the lead in insisting that we do not relinquish our pressure on Moscow, we do not relax the sanctions that Moscow has faced as a response to their behavior. And we will continue to be in the forefront of insisting that Russia must pay a price for what it has done.
This wasn't a setup, but I did see this hand go up earlier on, Mr. Pushkov. So there's a microphone will come here, please. On this side of the room, yep, thank you. Got to even it out a little bit. I'll come to you, madam, after this.
Alexei Pushkov, Upper Chamber, Russian Parliament. Mr. Johnson, you've cancelled your trip to Moscow, which was planned for April. Now it seems you decided to go there in December. What brings you to Moscow? Why now, and what do you expect from your talks with Mr. Lavrov?
Well, thank you very much, and welcome to London. I would just say this. Our relations with Russia at present, in view of what happened in Crimea, in view of outstanding issues between our country, which I need not delay this audience with, which will be familiar with the Litvinenko affair, they'll be familiar with our anxieties about cyber warfare and so on. Our relations with Moscow at the moment are difficult. And we know that, you know that, we all know that. And it's a great pity, by the way, because when I was mayor of this city, and certainly 20 years ago, it seemed possible that there would be another relationship. And I think we all go through this. I genuinely thought that we would be able to welcome Russia into the comity of democratic nations in the way that was envisaged by Bill Clinton and others in the 90s. It never really happened. And I think we have to do a bit of soul searching about why it didn't happen, how we lost Russia and what went wrong. Because I think there were faults on both sides. But we are where we are, and it's difficult. My answer to your question is I'm going to Moscow because, notwithstanding the difficulties, we have to engage. And there are things where, of course, we share priorities. There are areas that dealing with terrorism. You've got a football World Cup coming up. I think we're still in it.
Yeah.
England's still in it, I should say. England is still in it, let's be absolutely clear. England is still in the World Cup. We have issues to discuss about security of managing gigantic sporting events, in which I have some experience. There are things that we want to do together with Russia. So I'm looking forward to that trip. It won't be, I've been many, many times to Moscow. Indeed, I think I have ancestors from Moscow. Before becoming Foreign Secretary, I strategically stationed my ancestors around the world, as some of you may know. So I have family from there as well, and I'm looking forward to going back to my roots once again. But our policy on Russia, as you know, is engage but beware, or possibly beware but engage. It's one of the two. And that's, I'm afraid, what we're sticking to.
Time for a couple more questions. Madam, been waiting there. Lady there, please.
Thanks very much, Foreign Minister. I'm Emma Belcher from the MacArthur Foundation. I have a question specifically on nuclear weapons, and that is, I'm wondering if you would be able to comment on the impact of the ban movement. So the movement that started off as humanitarian consequences of nuclear war, that led to the ban treaty that was recently negotiated at the United Nations. So there are proponents and opponents, proponents saying it further legitimizes nuclear weapons, and opponents say it will undermine the NPT. Given where we are today, that there is a ban treaty in effect, and given the sort of damaging impact, I would say, it probably has had on disarmament diplomacy, what prospects do you see for future cooperation between the nuclear weapons states that did not support the treaty and the other countries that did?
Well, the ban treaty in the end, I understand the sentiments behind it, and I hope that those came through loud and clear from what I said earlier on in my speech about the horror of nuclear weapons. And so I completely understand the emotional drive. And of course that has to be right. On the other hand, my speech was also an argument for the NPT. And within the NPT it is clearly envisaged that as long as you have states, rogue states, with the potential to launch ICBMs at the continental United States, and indeed at this continent, at us here in Europe, then it is sensible for us, the P5, to maintain their nuclear deterrence. And I'm afraid that's the heart of what I was trying to say. I mean, I think the NPT, as framed, has stood the test of time, and we should stick with it. And yes, I'm afraid that the ban treaty did, in my view, undermine or tend to undermine the logic of the NPT.
Okay, White, yeah, with the paper up there, yeah.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary Alistair Bunker from Sky News. Policy towards North Korea has been all about preventing North Korea from obtaining a nuclear weapon. You could argue that has failed. Is it time now for the world to accept that North Korea is a nuclear state and adjust its policy accordingly in a way it did with Russia many decades ago? And if not, can you foresee any circumstances where you'd support a preemptive strike by America?
I just go back to what I said earlier on. I don't think anybody can conceivably want a military solution to this problem. And indeed, I know many who have studied the matter find it very hard to see how the nuclear solution, how a military solution might play out. I mean, and yet, clearly, it must remain on the table. There must be the possibility of some kind of military option. There is a spectrum of things that could be done. That possibility must, at least theoretically, be maintained on the table, which is why I said it was the duty of any president of the United States, given the threat that his or her country could face from a nuclear-armed North Korea. It is the duty of the president at least to explore those military options and to keep them on the table. But at the same time, I believe the really productive avenue of discussion is the one with the Chinese, is trying to get Pyongyang to the table, to try to get a halt in the program for Kim Jong Un to take a different course that would be to the benefit of his regime and indeed of his people. And that's what we're working for.
I think we've headed over time, sir, so I should let you, I've got a lot of hands up, but I'm not going to be able to give more time to do it. We're already a little over time, 20 past, so I have to say sorry to all of you who've been standing there with your hands up, waiting to ask questions.
That's all right.
Foreign Secretary has to go.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.